Every time I meet someone and they ask me what I do and I tell them I'm an anthropologist, they want me to tell the story of how Lucy was found. So I'm going to do that now, and each time I tell that story, I relive that incredible moment. It's certainly the defining moment of my professional career to have made a discovery like this. It was a moment that I look back on and will never forget that instant when I first laid eyes on the first bones. This is the locality. It's called Afar Locality 288. Every one of these places where we collect bones, we label with a number. And all the bones that are collected there go into a catalog under that particular number. So this was the 288th locality at the Hadar site where we began to collect fossils. And this was in late November of 1974, the second major field season. Remember the first season, I found the fossilized knee joint. And I was out with a former graduate student of mine, Tom Gray, and we had gone to this site because the year before we found a marvelous, huge, complete pig skull. And we collected it, but we didn't locate it on our maps. We just left a pile of stones where it was. So we went out to precisely put that onto our maps and our aerial photographs and decided to have a look around. And we didn't see very much. There weren't many bones in this area. But as we were walking by, where you see that red star on this picture, I happened to glance over my right shoulder, and I saw a tiny fragment of bone that led to the skeleton. So here you see a number of people a couple of days after the discovery who are beginning to search for all the fragments of that, what became known as the Lucy skeleton. So the first bone I saw was this anonymous-looking little wrench-shaped bone with a little notch in it, which is called the ulna. It is a bone that fits here. It is actually your elbow right there. That little bump right there is your elbow. And it allows you to flex and to extend at the elbow. And because of my knowledge of anatomy that I had studied in graduate school and in various classes devoted solely to osteology or bones, I knew immediately this could not come from any other kind of animal, that it had to come from a hominin. And as I kneeled down to look at it, I saw nearby fragments of a skull, thin little shards of a broken skull. It was very incomplete, but they were clearly recognizable. And then as I looked up the slope to my left, which is this area right in here, I began to see other pieces of a skeleton shining in the sun, glistening in the sun. And we began to mark with little markers that you see like this, little orange and blue ribbons with numbers written on them, recorded before we picked up each piece and carefully wrapped it in toilet paper, as you see my graduate student doing, with me making notes in the background. And we realized that this was part of a single skeleton. And we also knew from the geology, we didn't know precisely, but we had enough knowledge of that geological column to know that we were certainly in an area in excess of 3 million years. And most of the skeleton that we recovered was on the surface. It had eroded out because of a rainstorm and been scattered everywhere. I think the brain case acted like a ball when it came out, and it rolled, and unfortunately it broke up and most of it was washed away. But there were some pieces, valuable pieces, that did not get exposed, and that you see me excavating in this picture right here. That, what is emerging right at the tips of my finger, is the top edge, as unbelievable as it was at the moment, the top edge of the hip bone. So there was part of a pelvis. It was an extraordinary day. We went back to camp that night, celebrated the discovery with the entire team, and one of the expedition members, Pam, said, if you think this is a female, because I thought because of the small size of the bone fragments that it was a female. She said, why don't you call it Lucy? We were listening to the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and that's how she picked up that name, and she's been known as Lucy ever since. She certainly is, as I said, probably the best known fossil discovery of the 20th century of an early hominin. We see her in television programs, we see her in movies, we see her in crossword puzzles, and so on and so forth. And the Ethiopian government is very, very proud of this discovery. In Ethiopian, she's known as Dinkinesh, which means you are wonderful. She has her own Ethiopian name. She has her own Afar name also, which is Halomali, which also means you are wonderful. And the Ethiopian Ministry of Culture decided that this particular spot where I found Lucy on November 24th, 1974, should have a permanent stone marker placed. And a number of years ago, you see there is a cement marker in a marble stone with an engraving that reads, "At this locality, the 3.2 million year old skeleton of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, was discovered by D. Johansen on November 24th, 1974. So it's written in the Afar language at the top, it's written in the national language of Amharic, and it's written in English. And I'm happy to say that more and more people who are going as tourists to Ethiopia are led to this site and can see the exact place where she was found. Well, what did we find? We found roughly 40% of a skeleton. We found ribs and backbone, which were unusual. We found fragments of the skull, none of the face, unfortunately, which was frustrating because we didn't know what her face looked like. We had a complete lower jaw or mandible. We had parts of both arms. We had parts of both legs, and we had a pelvis and a sacrum, a tailbone. Now, it was found in 74, as I said, at Hadar, Ethiopia. Geologically, we know she's now dated very precisely at 3.2 million years, and ultimately picked up the scientific moniker or name Australopithecus afarensis. Australo, because earlier fossils have been called Australopithecus. Australo means, or Austral means southern, like Australia. Pithecus is Greek for ape, and naming her species afarensis after the Afar region and the Afar people. A number of things were immediately observable. For example, the length of her femur, her thigh bone, right here. It is 12 inches long, 28 centimeters long, short. Look at someone like myself, who's almost 6 feet tall. My thigh bone's about that long. It means, relatively speaking, she had very short lower limbs. This is long before natural selection had selected longer legs that we have today. So this is a leftover from her ape ancestry. And if you compare the length of the upper arm bone, the humerus, with the length of the femur, you see that it's about 85% the length of the femur. Our humerus is only 70% the length of the femur or thigh bone. So these are elements that were left over from her ape-like ancestors, and natural selection had not completed the process here of lengthening the lower limb. We had the, so when you look at a femur that long, 12 inches long, you can get a good idea of her stature. And she was only about 3.5 feet tall, or a little bit over a meter in stature. So people ask over and over, well, how do we know that this wasn't a child, an immature individual? How do we know that Lucy was actually an adult? And I'll return to that in a second. But what's very important is we had parts of the cranium, parts of the postcranium, all of this in a single specimen. So this is the first time we were able to associate the postcranial bones and the cranial bones. And that little femur that I found in 1973 is identical to Lucy's. And in terms of locomotion, we had the pelvis, we had the knee, and we had the ankle. And all of those showed us with incredibly in-depth studies that this was from an upright walking human or hominin. Well, Lucy's mandible is a secret, although we also see that the long bones, like the femur and the humerus and so on, have completed their growth. These bones don't grow as a single bone. They have growth centers at the ends of them in the middle, and those are fused together, which is a sign that she was biologically an adult. but also the teeth tell us this. We have a set of baby teeth or deciduous teeth that fall out. We have permanent teeth that come in. And our first permanent molar in modern humans comes in at about 6 years old, the second one at about 12, and the wisdom tooth at about 18. And once the wisdom tooth comes in, your biological growth is pretty much over, maybe 4 or 5 more years. But you see very clearly that Lucy had the first molar, the second molar, and the third molar, all adults. So she was biologically an adult when she died. But recent studies of the way the teeth developed suggest that she matured much more quickly than modern humans, much more like an ape. So rather than being 18 or 19 when she died, she was probably only around 11 or 12 when she died. She had a very short childhood as opposed to modern humans. The pelvis, of course, was crucial, something we had very, very few examples of before or after. But the pelvis would tell us certainly how similar she was to a modern biped. And you see Lucy's reconstructed pelvis at the top, and we had, remember, we had the left half, and we mirror imaged that, and we had the sacrum, the tailbone, so we have a pretty good idea of what that pelvis looked like. And on the left is a chimpanzee, that long, narrow pelvis with the blades facing forward. A human at the bottom, which is much more of a bowl. It's very wide and very short from top to bottom. So you can see that they're not identical. The hips really flare out for various biomechanical reasons. And the shape of the pelvic opening, the birth canal in Lucy at the bottom, as you can see, is more oval. It's called platypoid in technical terms. Whereas a modern human female, like the one at the top, has a very large opening from front to back and side to side, because our infants have fairly large brains. Lucy's brain was only about 380 cubic centimeters. So a newborn's brain was very small, and the constraints of giving birth were not crafting the shape of this particular pelvis. Ultimately, Owen Lovejoy at Kent State put together a reconstruction of the entire skeleton. Many of the elements were missing, as you can see. We had just a hand bone, a couple of foot bones, some of the ribs, not all of the backbone, and so on, and sort of did a reasonable reconstruction for what the skull would look like. Well, in 1975, the year after Lucy was discovered, another monumental discovery was made at Hadar by my team. When at a locality known as AL333, as opposed to AL288. And it was nicknamed the first family site because on that hillside, where you see AL333, there was a hillside littered with bones, hundreds of bones, and each one of them came from a hominin. And as we collected them and sorted them, we could see that there were remains of at least 13 to 18 different mandibles represented. So this was a site where adult males, adult females, infants, and children had died and were buried in an ancient lake stream. It was a catastrophic assemblage, as we say. It's about the same age as Lucy. It's maybe a little bit older than Lucy. And you can see how important stratigraphy is again, and correlations between sites, because here this layer is a volcanic ash right there, dated at 3.22. There's a volcanic ash layer up there at 3.18. So it constrains the time. We don't know how this assemblage got there. We don't know why they're all accumulated. They don't show any carnivore chewing marks on them. They don't show any signs of disease. It is what paleontologists would call a catastrophic assemblage. And all of them probably lived at the same time and experienced this mass death. And we don't have an explanation for that. This is more or less what that collection looks like. There's a fairly complete baby skull that died around probably age 3. And there are good fragments of an adult skull. You can't see it very well here, but it's the back and the sides of the skull. There are parts of a face. We were now getting an idea of what a skull might look like. So we reconstructed a skull right here of Afarensis. This was a hypothetical skull. You can see how it resembles a chimpanzee with a projecting face, a low-sloping forehead, a small brain, very different from our skulls, which are dominated by this very large brain, and a rather small, flat face. And in terms of brain size, Afarensis was down in the ape range. We now know it ranges between 380 and 550 cubic centimeters. Lucy herself was about 380. We today average about 1,400. We don't have a sloping forehead like they did. We have a very vertical forehead. So this is a dramatic contrast. So you see the undeniable stamp of an ape ancestry in this hypothetical reconstruction. And the red line, the horizontal line I should mention, is called the Frankfurt horizontal. That is a standard way to orient skulls when we compare them, with a line that runs from the bottom of the orbit to the top of the ear opening on each side. And that's called the Frankfurt horizontal or Frankfurt plane. We now have complete male skulls, as you see here, locality 444. We also have a beautifully complete female skull at about 3.1 million years of Lucy's species. And when you look at them side by side, you see a very strong difference in size, which is called sexual dimorphism. That males were much larger than females. We now have conclusive evidence for that, and we now have a pretty good idea of what Lucy's face looked like.